Today we are beginning the study of the book of Colossians. This book, we're just going to go over and look at all the different things, background, things you need to consider before you get there. And a lot of times we'll just jump into the text and not know where we're going and not appreciate maybe some of the background work that others had to do to get us there. And that's what I want us to start with here this morning, is to ask a question that a lot of times we don't ever bother asking, and that is about the authenticity of the book. Now, I hope that, you don't ever question this. You open up your Bible and you say, well, Colossians is in my Bible. The Bible is from God, and therefore Colossians is from God. And so we study it as the inspired Word of God. Now, that is correct, but there is actually a process before that of how do we know that this book should have been included, and that it is indeed from the Apostle Paul. So I want us to think about some things here, and I don't have all these on screen because Kevin got behind eating this week, so these things happen. So when you look at this, the question is really, as you're going through and you're considering authenticity, is what is its origin as far as in time frame? How is it treated early on? And what do we know historically about that work? That's kind of what we have to consider. And at the same time, I'll tell you kind of to offer the critique when people say, well, the Colossians is not actually written by Paul. You will find that in some commentaries. And the reasons why, there are two major reasons why people say these things. And that is, they say them because they think that the wording, the vocabulary is not the same as the other epistles. Now, the main ones that they think, they agree, everyone says, Paul wrote that, is Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians. Those are the ones, and that's kind of an interesting choice. But that they put those down as for sure he did. Colossians is right there on the bubble for these scholars. But it's because it has different vocabulary. Now, if you're writing to different people with different problems in a different area, wouldn't you expect the words to be a little bit different? This is where there tends to be just these scholarly assumptions that end up playing in on themselves, that I go in with my doubts, I create that what this evidence means is doubt, not evidence of the situation. And that's what you need to be aware of. The other thing they say, well, it's the latest reading, when I was reading and preparing for this, it really got me, because they argued both that it was thematically, and it's because of its Christology, study Christ, and ecclesiology, study the church, said, well, it's more developed than some and less developed than others. It's like Ephesians partially, which we agree with, but it's not entirely like Ephesians, and so maybe not. Now, I'm just going to say, try to handle it as a scholar, that's one of the dumbest things that you could ever say, is you write in contradiction into your own argument. But that's what you're going to get sometimes. Now, that's different, though, when you have people that are basically, they make their living as skeptics within the biblical world, if that even makes any sense to you. Okay, the most well known is probably Bart Ehrman. I'm guessing it's probably the most famous. But it's kind of they get a benefit from like being within religion and maintaining religion, but then they get credibility from all the people that are not religious because you have all the same conclusions they have, but you remain religious. See? It's that kind of dynamic going on. Okay. Now, I'm looking at this and I'm very afraid that I have downloaded and I have not updated this and it has none of the information on it. I'm getting afraid right now. But when you go through and you look at the reasons why, What you're looking for in the history is when it is included in lists. Okay, there are two things I want you to think about for this. First of all, Colossians appears on the early lists of canonical books, books that are recognized as being canonical, that they are inspired. People made these lists, they argued about them in the 2nd century. Marcion made a famous list that kind of started the ball rolling on all of that. But also, you have some examples of Paul's writings being put together and included, and sometimes, that's why Hebrews is sometimes question of did Paul write or not. They clearly didn't know either, because they would sometimes include Hebrews within those collections. But Colossians appears when they are collected together, and Chester Beatty is an example of an early papyri set of Paul's writings that includes Colossians. And it's a very early, one of our earliest examples set, and you can talk to Caleb later if you want to go see it, because he somehow managed to luck into that. But when you go through and you look at these things, is that all the evidence, there's no actual physical evidence, external evidence that would ever indicate that Colossians was not exactly what it claims to be. All of the attempts at evidence to present the book of Colossians as not being written by Paul, and when they say that, they usually say, but it was written by one of Paul's close associates, or it was by one of his disciples right after his death. Because it was, why? They have to acknowledge how familiar that person was with Paul and all of this. They can't explain, for example, at the end of the book, you have this list of all these particular people historically fitting in to a particular time period in Paul's life. Very specific. The way in which it does integrate with Ephesians. They say, well, they copied, it's funny when they get to Ephesians, Colossians copied from Ephesians, or what's even funnier is Ephesians, which they agree is from Paul, copied from Colossians. That one I really like. Paul was cribbing notes off of one of his students. That's really funny to me. Okay, so you end up getting those kind of things. Okay, so within this then, you get to, the author is Paul, though more specifically, okay, this is bad because I know I have notes here. And I'm looking at what you're looking at. Yes, you can draw all your conclusions about what that means and where I am for class. The nature of Paul then, in his authorship, number one, you once you get the background of the book and all the objections to it, you open it up and it starts, first word for you is Paul. Okay? So now that we've established its authenticity, or talked about that a little bit, when you go over and you say Paul, you have to think about what is significant about Paul writing a book. Okay? When you looked over and we studied 1 Corinthians and talked about that, well, Paul had a specific relationship with the Corinthians that you can read about beginning in Acts chapter 18. But we don't have that with Colossae. Matter of fact, the point of the book is that Paul had not taught these people. But rather, and there are different ways you want to pronounce his name. You see it in verse 7. You hear it Epaphras or Epaphras, it doesn't matter to me. But that here was the man who taught them. And so he is specifically talking, he is writing then to a group of people that were established as a congregation by what appears to be one of Paul's disciples. Now, if we turn over to Acts chapter 19, and I believe it's around verses 10 through 12, this is where you find Paul in Ephesus. It's immediately after the section in which Paul has encountered these men who had been baptized under Apollos' baptism, and he has this conversation with them, and then they are baptized again. And immediately after that, it says Paul stayed there for some time. He's in Ephesus. And at that time, he is teaching, it says, daily in what is known as the school of Tyrannus. Now, most likely what he was doing during that is, throughout the day, is he's preparing men to go out and to evangelize the area. and that Epaphras would have been one of those people. And so you get to this area, Ephesus was the big center. It was the big city, one of the biggest in the Roman Empire, actually. And so it was huge. It had all sorts of resources, people, and now he's like going out from there and sending them out into the countryside to some of the smaller places that he had not come in contact with, so that his work could still go on indirectly through other people. So what I want you to note, though, if you look again, we see Paul, but read again verse 1 now. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. It's really interesting how many times Paul includes Timothy in the authorship of the book, even though he is writing clearly with apostolic, and you see Paul as the dominant force. The fact that he was including Timothy, and he does this in several epistles. He'll throw in Timothy. It both highlights Timothy, that Timothy was with him, and that Timothy had a major role in what was going on during the time period of this writing. Okay, we'll get to the date in just a minute. But also that he was known well enough as someone who had traveled with Paul and been in that area, probably had interactions himself with Epaphras, often would travel to different places on his own when Paul didn't go, that he would have been another kind of source in all of this of benefit to tie the people together. Paco? That's a good thought until you get to chapter 4. And because we find out somebody else is the writer. So it's good thinking. Okay, so that's the foundation for all of this. Okay, so who do we have this written to then? We have the recipients are, in verse 2, to the saints and faithful brethren in Christ who are in Colossae. The core idea of all of this with them is, number one, he's writing to Christians. That is important. I think we take it for granted, but we don't need to take it for granted. Because that means that there were all sorts of things when you open a book and it's written to the church, it's written to the saints, then it's understood that there is a core set of priors, meaning there's background information of things they already have to have known and have done before they're going to get this work. And sometimes when people are studying, we go just flipping around to Scripture and acting like everything's written for people in the same category, in the same situation, and with the same background. And it's not true. And that's why you don't go where there's information in these books, say, about salvation. That's not why those books are written. It's written for people who have already learned that information, and therefore it is reinforcing that information from time to time, and it therefore will be written in a very different way than if you were approaching it just originally. Okay, those examples are found in the book of Acts, and so, to some extent you understand where Jesus was doing some of that early work too. Okay, so when we look at this, the saints are in Colossae, so it's the church there. That church, again, was established, from what we can tell within this book, by Epaphras. It would have been established when Paul was in Ephesus. That time frame then places it around, since his early time of writing 1 Corinthians is about 55. So it would have been, since he was there in Ephesus and probably wrote Corinthians, if you remember back from Ephesus, then that means that the timing of the congregation would have been probably around 55. Now, remember that when we get to the date of this writing. If the congregation was established around 55 AD, okay, keep that in mind. We can wiggle it back a little bit maybe, but that's important. So you've got Christians, an early church that were established based upon Epaphras, who had been taught by Paul when he was in the school of Tyrannus, and that this is where that congregation is. We don't have any idea of the size, just like we don't with any of the others. And we can get a little bit of a feel for it based upon the setting. Yep, still nothing. So the best idea of when we get this book is going to be the date would have been 61 or 62 AD. Now, that is based on this reasoning. When you get to the very end of the book, in Colossians 4, he says, remember my chains. That's the very last verse, which says he has not emphasized it throughout the writing, but it says he's a prisoner. But there's something else we have to consider. When you turn over to the book of Philemon, which oddly enough is recognized as being authentic, that you have the same people together, but one of the statements that's made by Paul to Philemon is he is expecting to be free before long. Now, if we want to go back and look at times in which Paul was a prisoner and expected to be freed, you'd either have to imagine a situation that's not recorded, or you'd have two examples of this. Really, there are three times we know that he was imprisoned for some lengthy period of time, that you'd have time to write a book, do all this work, and then still expect to be freed, or not. One would have been when he was captured in Judea, the whole issue after he got back to Jerusalem, and then he's held in Caesarea, mainly due to politics, and then he has to appeal to Caesar, and that's why they're keeping him, that problem. Okay, so he's there for about 2 years. Then you have the journey to Rome, it's recorded in Acts, and he's taken, and you see that at the very end of that book, where he is then taken and he becomes imprisoned in Rome. Now, we also know from the book of Philippians, he gives an example of where he is going to be getting released soon in the writing of that book. That's his expectation as he's writing the first chapter of Philippians. So it would stand to reason that Philippians and Philemon were written around the same time, and that would have been, the release point would have been from the first Roman imprisonment, whereas we know he was later, 2 Timothy, he was later returned to Rome, and that's where he was killed. Okay, so this first Roman imprisonment. But if what we have, because of the timing of that imprisonment in Rome from which he would be released, Philippians concurring with Philemon, Philemon, though, being written and sent to someone who is in Colossae at this time period, then that puts the writing of Colossae around the same time. Okay, so it's going to be 61 or 62 AD because of that. Now, remember the time frame. If this congregation was only established in the mid-50s, and they're receiving this letter less than 10 years after they were founded, again, it's very important when we're putting a book into context not to assume that we're talking about this long established congregation that's had all sorts of benefits, and what are they thinking? They're having to deal with the situation where they find themselves. They've not even met Paul. They don't have some of the benefits of that. They've got someone with miraculous gifts, but not someone who can give miraculous gifts. So whoever is there had to be someone that was doing that had outside contact without Paul coming to Colossae. Just so you understand, appreciate the situation. So what do we have in Colossae? Colossae as a city was originally, in the early writings, declared to be a great city. Now, that's relative. And I mean by that is that as time goes on, as cities grow, populations grow and change and shift, what was a great city and it took to be a great city at one time is very different. If you go back, for example, to the early days of this country, the largest cities are still large cities today. The biggest, does anyone know what the largest cities were in America in the colonial period? Boston was one, but there were two others that were bigger. Philadelphia was actually the biggest, and then New York City. Okay, so they are big cities now, but we measured that. If you're got to be a big city, that you got to have at least, right. Fort Worth just is decided to be 1 million people, kind of. That's a big city, right? Like when I was in, okay, I hope no one's watching here. When someone, well, I want people to watch, but you know what I mean. Several years ago, people said, well, the kids, I said, well, what happened? What did they decide? Well, they didn't like it in the country, so they decided to move to the city. I said, well, what do you mean? They said Amarillo. That was my reaction, but muffled, respectfully. Okay, it's relative, okay? You realize that Amarillo is bigger than any city in New Hampshire. It's relative. So Colossae at one time, yes, thank you, Roger. At one time, Colossae was a notable city. Now, it may not have been just due to size so much as location and its trade, and probably its economic value. And that probably shifted, is my guess, of why what we find out is it was diminished by the time we get to this time period. It was not what it used to be. Okay? Now, when you look at where, let me see, oh, hey, looky there, we get something to look at. Okay, so Colossae is in the interior, and I actually found conflicting evidence. It's right kind of on the line of whether or not Colossae was considered to be still in Asia on the far eastern side or part of Phrygia. I've actually found two different sources that disagreed about it. But you can see just north of there, you see Laodicea and Hierapolis, and you're going to see that Laodicea mentioned later on in the book, as well as in the book of Revelation. But notice its location from Ephesus. And I put specifically the Rhodes system up so you could appreciate how from Ephesus you could have a fairly easy time getting to Colossae. But I also want you to note what you find. You see the Meander River? Right? You ever talk about something meandering? He reigned during the early part of the 2nd century BC. And Daniel 11 in prophecy, but about what he did and some of the problems that he created. But he went in, and all of the Seleucids, they tended to have that policy of moving people around. But you end up with a significant Jewish minority within these cities. Because going back now, something that would have been, almost 200 years, more than 200 years. So that's kind of where we sit here for their background. I had notes. So when we look at this, you've got proximity, but you're kind of cut off as well. But what we're about to talk about in the situation, the background of having all of the Jewish background is really going to enter in for what we're going to find in this book. Okay? But it's not going to be, I think, what you expect. Okay? So what do we find just the situation? Okay. This is the old version of the presentation. So kind. It is clean. There's a very little need to take pictures of the slides. That's limited. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 options. I actually had it detailed to give you examples of all the reasons why, and now I have to do it off the top of my head, so we're going to see how well I do. First of all, the Judaizer option. Some have suggested that this was a Judaizing problem. And everyone, if you will, go ahead and turn over to chapter 2. The section that we're being most concerned about is verses 8 through 23 of that book. Okay? And of that chapter. So that's where it begins with beware, right? The philosophy. But it's going to then detail certain things, and you have it in essentially 3 different sections. The original section is focused on the law. Then you have a section that kind of varies from that, say around verses 16, I'd say to 19, something like that. And that's definitely not talking about stuff in the law. And then verses 20 through 23, you see a section in which it's more a concern with what's called asceticism, which is the whole idea of touch not, taste not, that kind of stuff, is withholding things from yourself as some part of religious kind of ritual or purification manner. Now, if you look at this distinction, what you find is the idea of Judaizers being present, number one, would have been odd because Judaizers mainly, from what we find, were those who were chasing Paul around. They recognized him as the threat, and it's unlikely they would have gone into places he hadn't even been. But also, that's not the argument he is making. You see circumcision mentioned in verses 11 and following, but it's not the argument like what you see in Galatians. Also, I think Galatians is earlier, and one of the first arguments that you find that he is having. This then, 10 years later, would indicate the beginning of a shift, in my opinion. But, so some think it's Judaizers, I don't think it's Judaizers. The arguments don't fit with Judaizers. So some say, well, this was the first book that's combating Gnosticism. Because when you look at it, the whole aesthetic idea of withholding yourself. When we studied 1 John, we talked about that idea of those who thought anything in the flesh was bad, and therefore you need to hold off away from that. And you kind of took a stoic kind of view to stay away from those things. Also, in Colossians 1, when you look down and see verse 9, for this reason we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. You've got a verse that speaks of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding all tightly together, and that's one reason to look and say, oh, those are Gnostic type words. But then you don't really see that kind of development. You have the aestheticism part of it, of holding off, but you don't see the same kind of thing with what you have in 1 John. So, and also historically, that seems pretty early for Gnostics. I mean, you have people that even argue 1 John is too early for Gnosticism. I think they're wrong about that. I call it proto-Gnosticism. But we're talking about a book that was written 30 years before that. So a generation before. So then that leaves us with something else. Okay? It clearly has to have and be supported by and related to the Jews extensively. Okay? So when we turn over here to chapter 2, when he goes through and he talks, for example, you're talking about circumcision in verse 11, but then if you drop down and you talk about uncircumcision of your flesh in verse 13, that's very much a Jewish kind of issue that he's addressing. And then you look at verse 14, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he's taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross, you're dealing with law. You're talking those requirements. So that's Jewish, okay? And then when you get down to verse 16, the results of this, he says, are not judging, and this maybe ought to make you think a little bit of Romans 14. Okay? Let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths. Well, that's pretty clear what we're talking about, right? That there's some kind of idea of what would be pushed of that's a Jewish life. All right? So that's definitely part of this. Has to be. He says, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance of Christ. Okay, good. But now we come down, and if you want to, we can go ahead and look at the last part, 20, because I want to look at and emphasize the middle part. In verse 20, if you died from Christ in the basic principles of the world, why as though living in the world do you subject yourself to regulations? And again, do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. Now, there are multiple ways to see that. You have this Gnostic kind of way, but it's also, there are certain things within Judaism that strict Judaism, you did those things. You don't taste that. That's food regular. You don't in any way want to touch that or handle it. Why? Because it makes you unclean. Okay? So you still have that going on. But specifically now, which all concern things which perish with the using according to the commandments and doctrines of men. Now that is a system. That's not a philosophy so much as a system. Okay? And now we look at verse 23, which I think is very important. These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom and self-imposed religion. That word's very interesting there. False humility, the word false is supplied, but makes sense within context. See it in verse 18 as well in a minute. And neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgences of the flesh. What is he saying? They are ritualistic, not spiritual. So he is dealing with things, the problems of pushing things that are ritualistic, oriented with the law, that go against Christianity. But now let's look at that middle section. Beginning in verse 18. Let no one cheat you of your reward, taking delight in false humility and worship of angels, intruding into those things which he has not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom all the body, nourished and knit together by joints and ligaments, grows with the increase that is from God. Now the head's already been identified. Colossians 1 verse 18 is Christ. Therefore, if you died from Christ from the basic principle of the world, you continue that. So now we've got our problem is, even in the middle section, you're talking about a worship, or technically the word is religion of angels. You're not going to get that at this time outside of Judaism. But it does tell us something about the problem. What would have been the origin of the people that are then teaching this if this is part of the issue? What we can immediately limit it. Who believed in angels? Not all Jews. It had to have been a Pharisaic origin. Okay? Now, where do you have and why this development of where it's something to the extent it would have been a religion or worship of angels? I'm asking for information for which you are ill prepared. Forgive me, it makes this job fun. All right. What you do not know, and there's no reason why you would. The Jewish information, the writings of the intertestamental period, mainly known that we have together collected as the pseudepigrapha, has huge sections of material, especially things that are a little bit apocalyptic in nature, devoted to angels. They have also, you might have heard of the book of Enoch, that's mentioned also in Jude. Okay. Imagine Enoch, but much, much worse. Okay, that's kind of first Enoch, second Enoch. You have a lot of material that develops angelology. Matter of fact, much of the angelology that tends to be expressed and known goes back to that material. It's rooted in that. Why? Well, because the Jews were writing, and this was going on. The church then accepted some of those writings, incorporated that into theirs. That became church tradition. Then John Milton got a hold of it and wrote Paradise Lost. And voila, we have angelology. Okay. But this is actually going back to that original issue because it was such a big thing. To kind of give you an idea about how big this was, the Jews, if you go back in Old Testament, you'll forgive me because I had to write about this recently, so I hope at least it's generally on my mind. When you go through the Old Testament, and you search for angel, just search for the word angel, okay? Most basic Bible programs can do that. You're going to find all sorts of instances, but now you have to go back and take out all the ones that are talking about the angel of the Lord, or in reference to the angel of the Lord, because heads up if we want to say that sometimes, that's Jesus. See, because you're manifesting God. That's what's said within those texts. So all those, but that was very confusing. If you're reading it now, you're going to be pretty confused by that, aren't you? It says angel, and then he's talking to him, and he says Lord. How do we do that? Well, that confused them too. But I say that to point out, the mention of angels themselves is not very big in the Old Testament, actually. This was all developed afterwards, especially, I suspect, I can't exactly prove it, because of their interest in Daniel, because it has much more angelology up front within the apocalyptic, and it was so important for the intertestamental period because of its prophecies about that period. So I suspect that Ezekiel, one of the nice things about the apocalyptic book, because it's symbolic, is that just like what you find today with the book of Revelation, you can take it and make it mean anything you want and write about it and build on it. And that's essentially what they did. Okay? So I go through all that to kind of give you an idea about what I think, with all of the evidence, was actually going on. But I want to sum it up, though, and give it some, try to take some of the difficulty out of it, and yet it'll complicate it. We tend to think, whenever there was a problem that there were within the church, and we read it, that there were some big-time teachers coming in and hammering people, and this was all going on, and that's why this was such an issue that they were addressing. That's not always how it goes. If you are living in a culture in which this is just a big deal and known, and hey, have you read this lately? Right? Have y'all ever had someone they've read a book about religion, they know you're a religious person, and so they recommend a book for you based upon the fact that you're a religious person? Several years ago, a friend of mine that had to do with some of my community work stuff, he recommended a book called The Bible Code to me. Anyone know what this book is about? Okay, now, for those of you that don't know this book, first of all, don't read it. Okay? Don't waste your time. It basically takes the Hebrew scriptures and treats it like a word search puzzle, where the most important words, not the words that are written, but the words in diagonal you can find as they are on the page, and then you put this clump of words, and then it becomes a word cluster kind of different kind of puzzle. What do all these words then mean together? And now the hidden words now are the important words, not the words that are actually written. Okay. Since if that can be done in the 21st century in America, do we really think that people could not have had, again, a lot of literature, interesting, fascinating? Some of the pseudepigrapha reads a little bit like a comic book. Okay, doesn't have the pictures, but it kind of has that kind of theme going on. So I think it was honestly. I think that a lot of their angelology was a attempt to develop something in their own mythology to counter the Greek mythology during the Hellenistic period. I haven't been able to have time to develop that out fully, but that's what I suspect. See? Okay. Oh, wow. We have 1 minute to answer that question. Thank you, David. Okay. Yes. No. The answer is yes. I believe, I didn't know if I went into it specifically at PTP when I went over these problems, but that's kind of where I'm going to why there's confusion in Colossians. I think that Colossians is kind of the beginning of a midway point that happened during the 60s AD, where you're out of Judaizing teaching per se, but you're not to Gnosticism yet. And you've got this kind of in-between character of where the Jewish scholarship and literature is being used a lot, and that's the in. That literature does have a lot, especially the angelology, it has a lot of characteristics that are similar to what we find in the earliest Gnostic, though they didn't write a whole lot, but some of the earliest Gnostic ideas about God, because they are both very much concerned with blaming someone other than man for their problems. And you have it developed, particularly, David, why I think Gnosticism developed from that, post-destruction of Jerusalem. God failed them. And now you strip all of this information out and just leave it as a straight philosophy, and you kind of get the origins, I think, of Gnosticism. But that's just a theory. All right, well, next time, maybe I will have a legitimate presentation that has an outline on it. There are outlines in the back if y'all are interested, want to preview, and we'll go over that next week.